Plants inside of your fish tank can be a very good thing. They do, in fact, do things like consume nitrate and help keep the water a bit more clean in various ways. However, I'm starting to think that perhaps a little too much plant, or at least this one particular plant, could be a little bit detrimental to my shrimp's health, and here's why. Plants consume carbon dioxide, and when they eat, they release oxygen. So they consume CO2, release O2, but during that process, that can unfortunately fluctuate pH a little bit. And the thing with shrimp is they hate change. They don't like pH swings. And I've always noticed that at a certain point when I start a new tank, my shrimps breed like crazy. And I usually add a plant in there to grow with it, so that as the shrimp population grows, the capacity for eating the nitrate that is produced in the tank naturally is taken care of, at least partly, by the plant. But that may not be such a hot idea. And here's my thought process on the matter. So these are my Bloody Mary shrimps. You know, they're skedoodling about, doing their things as shrimp do. And they've been doing okay, but I have noticed a death in the tank once every few days. And that doesn't bode well for a breeding tank. However, this tank over here doesn't have much of any plant going on inside of it. It's got a little bit of hair algae, but beyond that, not much. And in here was my neon yellow shrimps. I've since put them in my sanctuary tank by my upstairs tank. And this doesn't really have anything in here. But the thing is, my oldest living shrimps that I've ever had, which exceeded 2 years in this tank. That's a long time for a shrimp to be alive, at least these dwarf shrimp. They never had a problem. They did perfectly fine. I didn't even really feed them because there were so few of them. So then, these tanks, the orange, these guys populate like crazy. But every once in a while I see some dead ones, but not a whole lot. There's not as much plant as in here, and consequently, this tank with my Dream Blue Velvets, Skadoodle on about, has a lot of plant, especially at the surface with a lot of the duckweed that I just can't get rid of. But in addition to that, I have a bunch of these plants, and every once in a while, I see a shrimp die. So then, let's talk about the tanks over here, particularly involving this little guy. This is my crystal red shrimp, and at one point I had a lot of them, and they were breeding. I had several buried crystal red shrimps in this tank. Now, at the time, there wasn't any plants in there at all. There wasn't even actively buffered substrate. It was just my well water, the same thing that I used to breed all my shrimp. And believe it or not, they were doing really well for several months I had them. And during that time, I actually didn't have any deaths until I put in that plant. Once I put that plant in there, everything went to heck real quick. I started losing shrimp. And I started to think, that's a little strange. But perhaps this was something I should have paid attention to a little more seriously, because crystal reds, far more than my neos, are way more sensitive to parameter swings involving pH than any of the other shrimps I've ever had. So, perhaps that was the canary in the mine, so to speak. The thing I should have paid attention to. Yes, I know. Exact wrong parameters for that type of shrimp. But they were breeding, they were doing well, and they were thriving regardless. But that plant may have been just enough to cause some pH swings. Now, this swing tends to happen, from what I understand, during the on and off light cycle of the fish tanks, because when the lights are on, photosynthesis takes place, it consumes CO2, releases O2, pH of the tank thusly changes. When lights turn off, the photosynthesis doesn't happen because there's no light, and the pH gradually changes again, going back and forth. The more plants, the more photosynthesis, the more everything happens. So perhaps that's why things went to heck in a handbasket really quick once I added the plants. And then let's talk about this tank. This tank is rather strange. So I thought perhaps there was something in the water that I couldn't test that was messing up those shrimps. So I sent them over here, where there's plenty of biofilm, algae, and just a lot of everything in here. So I thought, okay, well, they'll at least have something to graze on, and nah, this didn't work very well either. This is the last of those crystal reds from that experiment. By the way, the experiment's not over. I have some other plans to take care of, or to try in the summer. I can't really get any more crystal reds to test because it is freaking cold out right now. But this little guy is doing okay. But that's probably due to something that has changed in this tank, because this tank, as you can see, had a ton of bush algae, like all over, like intense amounts of it. So what I did is I added 3 of my best nearite snails in this tank because they will eat algae all day long, and that's just what they love to do. So between that nearite snail, and I actually don't know where the other nearites are. They're probably behind this rock here. I got 3 nearites in here, and as the algae kept coming down in quantity because of them being eaten. Oh, wait. Is that one? Yep, that's one of my tigers. So as the algae kept being eaten, the die-off of the shrimp kept getting lower and lower. Algae is a plant. Photosynthesis, it's the same thing. It's the same problem. I think what I need to do in this crazy crystal red experiment is to just not have plants. The reason why you have a buffering substrate is more or less to help maintain the pH. But that being said, granted my pH is high, but my KH and GH are also really high, which, yeah, the high GH probably isn't the greatest for these softwater shrimp. I realize that. But that KH did a lot for stabilizing the water. The problem is when you introduce other things in vast quantities, especially with sensitive creatures, more sensitive than the ones I'm usually dealing with, that buffering capability is not enough to deal with those with the plants causing pH swings. At least that is the idea. I can't really say for sure if that's really the case or not. I've got a bunch of creatures, and some of them, like my snails, absolutely love the high pH because acidic water will erode their shells. And they like the hard water because they need the nutrients in the hard water and algae and stuff for their shells. Shrimps have an exoskeleton. They do need a bunch of calcium for that every time they molt. In fact, there's one of the molts in there. But balancing this whole thing has been a little bit of a ride, and it really catches me off guard here and there as to what's going on when I don't really sit down and think about it at the tiniest level here. So, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to clear as much algae out and then have a cleanup crew like my nearites maintain the cleaning of algae in this tank. And that will essentially be my test bed for some crystal reds. Now, in comparison, what I'm going to do with this tank is do a proper crystal red shrimp tank where I use buffered substrate, like fluval stratum, and then RODI water mixed with salty shrimp to get the perfect, ideal conditions for crystal reds. That should be perfectly good enough to breed them, and then once I get mass quantities of them in-house, I will then continue the experiment with alternate water parameters to see if it's even possible. That way I don't have to keep buying shrimp. But this whole thing still stems back to all of these tanks with even my Neos. The more plants you have, yes, the higher the rate of the consumption of nitrate, but when it comes to little shrimps, which are sensitive to a lot of things, perhaps the trade-off of consuming nitrate is not better than the possible swinging of pH due to those plants. So I'm going to be testing this for a while, and I'll have to just post my results as I go, because, well, I got 4 different tanks, same species, different color morph, but it's worth looking into.